Hi, hello. Welcome back to my channel, read by Angelique. I am Angelique. Surprise, surprise. Today we are continuing on with Persuasion by Jane Austen. I have a little bit of a cold, so probably won't go that long today. I'm gonna try to get through one chapter. But I've got my tea and I'm set to go. It's getting cold outside. I'm feeling it. And it makes me just want to read more and more books. So let's review a little bit of what has happened. In my last video, we read chapter 14, 15, and 16. Anne has gone from Uppercross and she has reconnected with her family that's displaced and living in Bath. And once she arrived in Bath, she found that her family wasn't really they weren't missing her necessarily. The only reason they really enjoyed having her company is because they could talk about all the amazing things they've done, the people that they had met and seen their high society in Bath. And Anne was disappointed because she had hoped that having to move to a new town because they were essentially bankrupt, that they would be a little bit more subdued, that they would learn from their lesson, be a little bit more economical and things like that. And that was not the case. They were in full force, just trying to be the biggest and the best, the baddest of baddies in Bath. That's great. The baddest baddies in Bath. Too happy with myself right now. Anyway, so she makes it to Bath to find that her cousin that she had ran into in Lyme, they didn't know that they were cousins at the time, is actually in Bath now and reacquainted with her father. And they had so this is a cousin at this time period, the closest oh my gosh, I have to keep my hands down. Last time I did a thumbs up in it. Anyway, I'm sure it's a setting that I could change. Anyway, they this cousin, so at this time period, the closest male relative would be the heir. If you didn't have a son, then it went to the next in line. So it would be your uncle or your uncle's son or something like that. And so their cousin is the closest male relative and therefore the heir of Kellynch Hall. But at some point he at that in that time, if you were the heir, you kind of tried to garner favor with your family and maybe even try to marry someone amongst your cousins to keep the house and the estate within the family. See, there's a thumb. I can't control it. It doesn't happen when I want it to happen, but anyway, keeps things interesting if I am droning on and too boring. Anywho, he chose not to do that, cousin, who I forgot the name of currently. And he married a rich woman with no title and kind of had family estrangement. But now he is a widow and is free to do as he pleases. I think she's only been dead like 4 months. And he's in Bath and has rekindled relationship with the Elliots and is actually getting along quite well with Anne. Him and Anne, they are honest with each other. They have good conversation. He seems to like Elizabeth and sister and the dad. He is very against the father's relationship with Elizabeth's friend that's been with them for their whole season in Bath, because he thinks it would be a degrading marriage, but methinks that maybe he is afraid that they will get married and have an heir, a boy, and he wouldn't get the Kellynch estate. But that's just conjecture. I don't know. So this is where we are in Bath. They're kind of just like getting resettled, reacquainted. Anne is regularly getting some correspondence from Uppercross to know how Louisa is faring because she was injured, getting some updates on Captain Wentworth, etc., etc. I think that's where it's ended. And then we're jumping back in to Bath. Society. Let me yeah. We ended with the cousin saying that he does not like Miss Clay for Mr. Elliot. Sir Walter Elliot. Sip of tea, and then we shall begin chapter 17. Still so hot. Persuasion by Jane Austen, chapter 17. Sir Walter and Elizabeth were assiduously pushing their good fortune in Laura Place, Anne was renewing an acquaintance of a very different description. She had called on her former governess. Oh yeah, I forgot. In the last chapters, a baronet came into Bath, which is like the highest title in that you can get, a lady, and happened to be a cousin of the Elliots. So Sir Walter and Elizabeth Elliot were being acquainted to this baronet and have been really striving for that connection. And so that's why it's like contrary to the upper class connection and has a different connection she is pursuing. She had called on her former governess and had heard from her of there being an old schoolfellow in Bath who had the two strong claims on her attention, a past kindness and present suffering. Miss Hamilton, now Miss Smith, had shown her kindness in one of those periods of her life when it had been most valuable. Anne had gone unhappy to school, grieving for the loss of a mother whom she had dearly loved, feeling her separation from home and suffering as a girl of 14, of strong sensibility and not high spirits, must suffer at such a time. And Miss Hamilton, 3 years older than herself, but still from the want of near relations and a settled home, remaining another year at school, had been useful and good to her in a way which had considerably lessened her misery, and could never be remembered with indifference. Miss Hamilton had left school, had married not long afterwards, was sad to have married a man of fortune, and this was all that Anne had known of her, and was said, not sad, was said to have married a man of fortune, and this was all that Anne had known of her, till now that their governess's account brought her situation forward in a more decided but very different form. She was a widow, and poor. Her husband had been extravagant, and at his death about 2 years before had left his affairs dreadfully involved. She had had difficulties of every sort to contend with, and in addition to these distresses had been afflicted with a severe rheumatic fever, which finally settled in her lungs, had made her for the present a cripple. She had come to Bath on that account, and was now in lodgings near the hot baths, living in a very humble way, unable to even afford herself the comfort of a servant, and of course almost excluded from society. Their mutual friend answered for the satisfaction which a visit from Miss Elliot would give Miss Smith, and Anne therefore lost no time in going. She mentioned nothing of what she had heard, or what she intended, at home. It would excite no proper interest there. She only consulted Lady Russell, who entered thoroughly into her sentiments, and was most happy to convey her as near to Miss Smith's lodgings as Westgate Buildings, as Anne chose to be taken. The visit was paid, their acquaintance re-established, their interest in each other more than rekindled. The first 10 minutes had its awkwardness and its emotion. 12 years were gone since they had parted, and each presented a somewhat different person from what the other had imagined. 12 years had changed Anne from the blooming, silent, unformed girl of 15 to the elegant little woman of 27, with every beauty excepting bloom, and with manners as consciously right as they were invariably gentle. And 12 years had transformed the fine-looking, well-grown Miss Hamilton in the all glow of health and confidence of superiority, into a poor, infirm, helpless widow, receiving the visit of her former protege as a favor. But all that was uncomfortable in the meeting had soon passed away and left only the interesting charm of remembering former partialities and talking over old times. Anne found in Miss Smith the good sense and agreeable manners which she had almost ventured to depend on, and a disposition to converse and be cheerful beyond her expectation. Neither the disappointments of the past, and she had lived very much in the world, nor the restrictions of the present, neither sickness nor sorrow seemed to have closed her heart or ruined her spirits. In the course of a second visit, she talked with great openness, and Anne's astonishment increased. She could scarcely imagine a more cheerless situation in itself than Miss Smith's. She had been very fond of her husband. She had buried him. She had been used to affluence. It was gone. She had no children to connect her with life and happiness again, no relations to assist in the arrangement of perplexed affairs, no health to make all the rest supportable. Her accommodations were limited to a noisy parlor and a dark bedroom behind, with no possibility of moving from one to the other without assistance, which there was only one servant in the house to afford, and she never quitted the house but to be conveyed into the warm bath. Yet, in spite of all of this, Anne had reason to believe that she had more moments only of languor and depression to hours of occupation and enjoyment. How could it be? She watched, observed, reflected, and finally determined that this was not a case of fortitude or of resignation only. The submissive spirit might be patient, a strong understanding would supply resolution, but here was something more. Here was that elasticity of mind, that disposition to be comforted, that power of turning readily from evil to good, and of finding employment which carried her out of herself, which was from nature alone. It was the choicest gift of heaven, and Anne viewed her friend as one of those instances in which, by a merciful appointment, it seemed designed to counterbalance almost every other want. There had been a time, Miss Smith told her, when her spirits had nearly failed. She could not call herself an invalid now, compared with her state on first reaching Bath. Then she had indeed been a pitiable object, for she had caught cold on the journey and had hardly taken possession of her lodgings before she was again confined to her bed and suffering under severe and constant pain. And all this among strangers, with the absolute necessity of having a regular nurse, and finances at that moment particularly unfit to meet any extraordinary expense. She had weathered it, however, and could truly say that it had done her good. It had increased her comforts by making her feel herself to be in good hands. She had seen, too, much of the world, to expect sudden or disinterested attachment anywhere, but her illness had proved to her that her landlady had a character to preserve, and would not use her ill, and she had been particularly fortunate in her nurse, as a sister of her landlady, a nurse of profession, and who had always a home in that house when unemployed, chanced to be at liberty just in time to attend her. And she, said Miss Smith, besides nursing me most admirably, has really proved an invaluable acquaintance. As soon as I could use my hands, she taught me to knit, which has been a great amusement, and she put me in the way of making these little thread cases, pincushions, and card racks which you always find me so busy about, and which supply me with the means of doing a little good to one or two very poor families in this neighborhood. She has a large acquaintance, of course, professionally, among those who can afford to buy, and she disposes of my merchandise. She always takes the right time for applying. Everybody's heart is open, you know, when they have recently escaped from severe pain or are recovering the blessing of health, and Nurse Rook thoroughly understands when to speak. She is a shrewd, intelligent, sensible woman. Hers is a line for seeing human nature, and she has a fund for good sense and observation which, as a companion, make her infinitely superior to thousands of those who, having only received the best education in the world, know nothing worth attending to. Call it gossip if you will, but when Nurse Rook has half an hour's leisure to bestow on me, she is sure to have something to relate that is entertaining and profitable, something that makes one know one's species better. One likes to hear what is going on, to be au fait as to the newest modes of being trifling and silly. To me, who live so much alone, her conversation, I assure you, is a treat. Anne, far from wishing to cav- cavil at the pleasure, replied, I can easily believe it. Women of that class have great opportunities, and if they are intelligent, may be well worth listening to. Such varieties of human nature as they are in the habit of witnessing, and it is not merely in its follies that they are well read, for they see it occasionally under every circumstance that can be most interesting or affecting. What instances must pass before them of ardent, disinterested, self denying attachment, of heroism, fortitude, patience, resignation, of all the conflicts and all the sacrifices that ennoble us most. A sick chamber may often furnish the warmth of volumes. Yes, said Miss Smith, more doubt. Um, I think it's doubtingly. Sometimes it may, though I fear its lessons are not often in the elevated style you describe. Here and there human nature may be great in times of trial, but generally speaking it is its weaknesses and not its strength that appears in a sick chamber. It is selflessness and impatience rather it is selfishness and impatience rather than generosity and fortitude that one hears of. There is so little real friendship in the world, and unfortunately, speaking low and tremulously, there are so many who forget to think seriously till it is almost too late. You take a sip of tea. So, what they just said was, uh, Miss Rook likes to gossip, and Anne was hoping that the lessons that she learned being by a sick bed were of character and things, but apparently not. They're a little bit more entertaining towards the gossip and the more negative, selfish sides of humanity. Anne saw the misery of such feelings. The husband had not been what he ought, and the wife had been led among that part of mankind which made her think worse of the world than she hoped it deserved. It was but a passing emotion, however, with Miss Smith. She took it off, and soon added in a different tone, I do not suppose the situation my friend Miss Rook is in at present will furnish much either to interest or edify me. She is only nursing Miss Wallace, of Marlborough Buildings, a mere pretty, silly, expensive, fashionable woman, I believe, and of course will have nothing to report but of lace and finery. I mean to make my profit of Miss Wallace, however. She has plenty of money, and I intend she shall buy all the high-priced things I have in hand now. Anne had called several times on her friend before the existence of such a person was known in Camden Place. At last it became necessary to speak of her. Sir Walter, Elizabeth, and Miss Clay returned one morning from Laura Place, with a sudden invitation from Lady Dalrymple for the same evening, and Anne was already engaged to spend that evening in Westgate Buildings. She was not sorry for the excuse. They were only asked, she was sure, because Lady Dalrymple, being kept at home by a bad cold, was glad to make use of the relationship which had been so pressed on her, and she declined on her own account with great alacrity. She was engaged to spend the evening with an old schoolfellow. They were not much interested in anything relative to Anne, but still there were questions enough to ask to make it understood that this old schoolfellow was, and Elizabeth was disdainful, and who was her husband? One of the 5,000 Mr. Smiths whose names are to be me with everywhere. And what is her attraction? That she is old and sickly. Upon my word, Miss Anne Elliot, you have the most extraordinary taste. Everything that revolts other people, low company, paltry rooms, foul air, disgusting associations, are inviting to you. But surely you may put off this old lady till tomorrow. She is not so near her end, I presume, but that she may hope to see another day. What is her age? 40? No, sir. She is not 1 and 30, but I do not think I can put off my engagement, because it is the only evening for some time which will at once suit her and myself. She goes into the warm bath tomorrow, and for the rest of the week, you know, we are engaged. But what does Lady Russell think of the acquaintance? Asked Elizabeth. She sees nothing to blame in it, replied Anne. On the contrary, she approves it, and has generally taken me when I have called on Miss Smith. Westgate Buildings must have been rather surprised by the appearance of a carriage drawn up near its pavement, observed Sir Walter. Sir Henry Russell's widow, indeed, has no honours to distinguish her arms, but still it is a handsome equipage, and no doubt is well known to convey a Miss Elliot. A widow, Miss Smith, lodging in Westgate Buildings, a poor widow, barely able to live between 30 and 40, a mere Miss Smith, an everyday Miss Smith, of all the people and all names in the world, to be the chosen friend of Miss Anne Elliot, and to be preferred by her to her own family connections among the nobility of England and Ireland. Miss Miss Smith, such a name! Miss Clay, who had been present while all this passed, now thought it advisable to leave the room, and and Anne could have said much and did long to say a little, in defiance of her friend's not very dissimilar claims to theirs, but her sense of personal respect to her father prevented her. She made no reply. She left it to himself to recollect that Miss Smith was not the only widow in Bath between 30 and 40 with little to live on and no surname of dignity. I think that was a slight to her father. Anne kept her appointment, the others kept theirs, and of course she heard the next morning that they had had a delightful evening. She had been the only one of the set absent, for Sir Walter and Elizabeth had not only been quite at their ladyship's service themselves, but had actually been happy to be employed by her in collecting others, and had been at the trouble of inviting both Lady Russell and Mr. Elliot, and Mr. Elliot had made a point of leaving Colonel Wallis early, and Lady Russell had fresh arranged all her evening engagements in order to wait on her. Anne had the whole history of all that such an evening could supply from Lady Russell. To her, its greatest interest must be in having been very much talked of between her friend and Mr. Elliot, in having been wished for, regretted, and at the same time honoured for staying away in such a cause. Her kind, compassionate visits to this old schoolfellow, sick and reduced, seemed to have quite delighted Mr. Elliot. He thought her a most extraordinary young woman, in her temper, manners, mind, a model of female excellence. He could meet even Lady Russell in a discussion of her merits, and Anne could not be given to understand so much by her friend, could not know herself to be so highly rated by a sensible man, without many of those agreeable sensations which her friend meant to create. So basically, Mr. Elliot was talking up Anne Elliot and how amazing she was, and Lady Russell was telling Anne about it in hopes that this would spark Anne's interest in Mr. Elliot, but she found that it didn't stir things like she thought or expected it would in another female. Lady Russell was now perfectly decided in her opinion of Mr. Elliot. She was as such convinced of his meaning to gain Anne in time as of his deserving her, and was beginning to calculate the number of weeks which would free him from all the remaining restraints of widowhood, and leave him at liberty to exert his most open powers of pleasing. She would not speak to Anne with half the certainty she felt on the subject. She would venture on little more than hints of what might be hereafter, of a possible attachment on his side, of the desirableness of the alliance, supposing such attachment to be real and returned. Anne heard her, and made no violent exclamations. She only smiled, blushed, and gently shook her head. "I am no matchmaker, as you well know," said Lady Russell, being much too well aware of the uncertainty of all human events and calculations. "I only mean that if Mr. Elliot should some time hence pay his addresses to you, and if you should be disposed to accept him, I think there would be every possibility of your being happy together. A most suitable connection, everybody must consider it, but I think it might be a very happy one. Mr. Elliot is an exceedingly agreeable man, and in many respects I think highly of him," said Anne, "but we should not suit." Lady Russell let this pass, and only said in rejoinder, "I own that to be able to regard you as a future mistress of Kellynch, the future Lady Elliot, to look forward and see you occupying your dear mother's place, succeeding to all her rights and all her popularity, as well as to all her virtues, would be the highest possible gratification to me. You are your mother's self in countenance and disposition, and if I might be allowed to fancy you such as she was, in situation and name, and home, presiding and blessing in the same spot, and only superior to her in being more highly valued. My dearest Anne, it would give me more delight than is often felt at my time of life. Anne was obliged to turn away, to rise to walk to a distant table, and leaning there in pretended employment, try to subdue the feelings this picture excited. For a few moments her imagination and her heart were bewitched. The idea of becoming what her mother had been, of having the precious name of Lady Elliot first revived in herself, of being restored to Kellynch, calling it her home again, her home for ever, was a charm which she could not immediately resist. Lady Russell said not another word, willing to leave the matter to its own operation, and believing that could Mr. Elliot at that moment with propriety have spoken for himself, she believed in short what Anne did not believe. The same image of Mr. Elliot speaking for himself brought Anne to composure again. The charm of Kellynch and of Lady Elliot all faded away. She never could accept him, and it was not only that her feelings were still adverse to any man save one. Her judgment on a serious consideration of the possibilities of such a case was against Mr. Elliot. Though they had now been acquainted a month, she could not be satisfied that she really knew his character, that he was a sensible man, an agreeable man, that he talked well, professed good opinions, seemed to judge properly, and as a man of principle, this was all clear enough. He certainly knew what was right, nor could she fix on any one article of moral duty evidently transgressed, but yet she could have been afraid to answer for his conduct. She distrusted the past, if not the present. The names which occasionally dropped of former associates, the allusions to former practices and pursuits, suggested suspicions not favourable of what he had been. She saw that there had been bad habits, that Sunday travelling had been a common thing, that there had been a period of his life, and probably not a short one, when he had been at least careless on all serious matters. And though he might now think very differently, who could answer for the true sentiments of a clever, cautious man, grown old enough to appreciate a fair character? How could it ever be ascertained that his mind was truly cleansed? Mr. Elliot was rational, discreet, polished. But he was not open. There was never any burst of feeling, any warmth of indignation or delight at the evil or good of others. This, to Anne, was a decided imperfection. Her early impressions were incurable. She prized the frank, the open-hearted, the eager character beyond all others. Warmth and enthusiasm did captivate her still. She felt that she could so much more depend upon the sincerity of those who sometimes looked or said a careless or a hasty thing than those whose presence of mind never varied, whose tongue never slipped. Mr. Elliot was too generally agreeable. Various as were the tempers in her father's house, he pleased them all. He endured too well, still too well with everybody. He had spoken to her with some degree of openness of Miss Clay, had appeared completely to see what Miss Clay was about, and to hold her in contempt, and yet Miss Clay found him as agreeable as anybody. Lady Russell saw either less or more than her young friend, for she saw nothing to excite distrust. She could not imagine a man more exactly what he ought to be than Mr. Elliot, nor did she ever enjoy a sweeter feeling than the hope of seeing him receive the hand of her beloved Anne in Kellynch Church in the course of the following autumn. That's the end of chapter 17. My throat is waning. That was a lot of dialogue and a lot of like character building situation-ish stuff, and I want progress. Let me see how many pages are in the next chapter and if I feel like I could last. Possibly. I might attempt it. I don't know if you can tell my voice is getting lower. A little. Is it sultry? Maybe not. It's like gravelly in my head. I can feel it rumble. It's not the same length. I need to switch my legs. Don't mind me cutting off circulation. Chapter 18. It was the beginning of February, and Anne, having been a month in Bath, was growing very eager for news from Uppercross and Lyme. She wanted to hear much more than Mary communicated. It was 3 weeks since she had heard at all. She only knew that Henrietta was at home again, and that Louisa, though considered to be recovering fast, was still at Lyme. And she was thinking of them all very intently one evening, when a thicker letter than usual from Mary was delivered to her, and to quicken the pleasure and surprise with Admiral and Miss Croft's compliments. The Crofts must be in Bath, a circumstance to interest her. They were people whom her heart turned to very naturally. "What is this?" cried Sir Walter. "The Crofts arrived in Bath? The Crofts, who rent Kellynch? What have they brought you?" "A letter from Uppercross Cottage, sir." "Oh, those letters are convenient passports. They secure an introduction. I should have visited Admiral Croft, however, at any rate. I know what is due to my tenant." Anne could listen no longer. She could not even have told how the poor Admiral's complexion escaped. Her letter engrossed her. It had been begun several days back. February 1st. My dear Anne, I make no apology for my silence, because I know how little people think of letters in such a place as Bath. You must be a great deal too happy to care for Uppercross, which, as you well know, affords little to write about. We have had a very dull Christmas. Mr. and Miss Musgrove have not had one dinner party all the holidays. I do not reckon the Hayters as anybody. The holidays, however, are over at last. I believe no children ever had such long ones. I am sure I had not. The house was cleared yesterday, except the little Harvilles, but you will be surprised to hear that they have never gone home. Miss Harville must be an odd mother to part with them so long. I do not understand it. They are not at all nice children, in my opinion, but Miss Musgrove seems to like them quite as well, if not better, than her grandchildren. What dreadful weather we have had! It may not be felt in Bath, with your nice pavements, but in the country it is of some consequence. I have not had a creature all on me since the second week in January, except Charles Hayter, who has been calling much oftener than was welcome. Between ourselves, I think it a great pity Henrietta did not remain at Lyme as long as Louisa. It would have kept her a little out of his way. The carriage is gone today, to bring Louisa and the Harvilles tomorrow. We are not asked to dine with them, however, till the day after. Miss Musgrove is so afraid of her being fatigued by the journey, which is not very likely, considering the care that will be taken of her, and it would be much more convenient to me to dine there tomorrow. I am glad you find Mr. Elliot so agreeable, and wish I could be acquainted with him too, but I have my usual luck. I am always out of the way when anything desirable is going on, always the last of my family to be noticed. What an immense time Miss Clay has been staying with Elizabeth. Does she never mean to go away? Well, perhaps if she were to leave the room vacant, we might not be invited. Let me know what you think of this. I do not expect my children to be asked, you know. I can leave them at the great house very well, for a month or 6 weeks. I have this moment heard that the Crofts are going to Bath almost immediately. They think the Admiral gouty. Charles heard it quite by chance. They have not had the civility to give me any notice, or offer to take anything. I do not think they improve at all as neighbours. We see nothing of them, and this is really an instance of gross inattention. Charles joins me in love, and everything proper. Yours affectionately, Mary. I am sorry to say that I am very far from well, and Jemima just told me that the butcher says there is bad sore throat very much about. I dare say I shall catch it, and my sore throats, you know, are always worse than anybody's. So ended the first part, which had been afterward put into an envelope containing nearly as much more. I kept my letter open that I might send you word how Louisa bore her journey, and now I am extremely glad I did, having a great deal to add. In the first place, I had a note from Miss Croft yesterday, offering to convey anything to you, a very kind, friendly note indeed, addressed to me just as it ought. I shall therefore be able to make my letter as long as I like. The Admiral does not seem very ill, and I sincerely hope Bath will do him all the good he wants. I shall be truly glad to have them back again. Our neighbourhood cannot spare such a pleasant family. But now for Louisa. I have something to communicate that will astonish you not a little. And the Harvilles come on Tuesday very safely, and in the evening we went to ask her how she did. When we were rather surprised not to find Captain Benwick of the party, for he had been invited as well as the Harvilles. And what do you think was the reason? Neither more nor less than his being in love with Louisa, and not choosing to venture to Uppercross till he had had an answer from Mr. Musgrove, for it was all settled between him and her before she came away, and he had written to her father by Captain Harville. True, upon my honour. Are not you astonished? I shall be surprised at least if you ever received a hint of it, for I never did. Miss Musgrove protests solemnly that she knew nothing of the matter. We are all very well pleased, however, for though it is not equal to her marrying Captain Wentworth, it is infinitely better, for Charles Hayter and Mr. Musgrove has written his consent, and Captain Benwick is expected today. Mr. Harville says her husband feels a good deal on his poor sister's account, but, however, Louisa is a great favourite with both. Indeed, Miss Harville and I quite agree that we love her the better for having nursed her. Charles wonders what Captain Wentworth will say, but if you remember, I never thought him attached to Louisa. I never could see anything of it, and this is the end, you see, of Captain Benwick's being supposed to be an admirer of yours. How Charles could take such a thing into his head was always incomprehensible to me. I hope he will be more agreeable now. Certainly not a great match for Louisa Musgrove, but a million times better than marrying among the Hayters. What? I didn't realize that it came out in the letter, because in the movies, Anne doesn't hear that Louisa is marrying Captain, or is engaged to Captain Benwick until much later. So she has like this season of assuming that Louisa is married to Captain Wentworth. Anyway. Mary need not have feared her sister's being in any degree prepared for the news. She had never in her life been more astonished. Captain Benwick and Louisa Musgrove! It was almost too wonderful for belief, and it was with the greatest effort that she could remain in the room, preserve an air of calmness, and answer the common questions of the moment. Happily for her, they were not many. Sir Walter wanted to know whether the Crofts travelled with 4 horses, and whether they were likely to be situated in such a part of Bath as it might suit Miss Elliot and himself to visit in, but had little curiosity beyond. "How's Mary?" said Elizabeth, and without waiting for an answer, "And pray what brings the Crofts to Bath?" They come on the Admiral's account. He is thought to be gouty." "Gout and decrepitude," said Sir Walter. "Poor old gentleman." "Have they any acquaintance here?" asked Elizabeth. "I do not know, but I can hardly suppose that at Admiral Croft's time of life, and in his profession, he should not have many acquaintance in such a place as this." "I suspect," said Sir Walter coolly, "that Admiral Croft will be best known in Bath as the renter of Kellynch Hall. Elizabeth, may we venture to present him and his wife in Laura Place?" "Oh, no, I think not. Situated as we are with Lady Dalrymple, cousins, we ought to be very careful not to embarrass her with acquaintance she might not approve. If we were not related, it would not signify, but as cousins we should feel scrupulous as to any proposal of ours. We had better leave the Crofts to find their own level. There are several old-looking men walking about here, who I am told are sailors. The Crofts will associate with them." This was Sir Walter and Elizabeth's share of interest in the letter. When Miss Clay had paid her tribute of more decent attention in any inquiry after Miss Charles Musgrove and her fine little boys, Anne was at liberty. In her own room she tried to comprehend it. Well might Charles wonder how Captain Wentworth would feel. Perhaps he had quitted the field, had given Louisa up, had ceased to love, had found he did not love her. She could not endure the idea of treachery or levity, or anything akin to ill usage between him and his friend. She could not endure that such a friendship as theirs could be severed unfairly. Captain Benwick and Miss Musgrove! The high-spirited, joyous, talking Louisa Musgrove, and the dejected, thinking, feeling, reading Captain Benwick, seemed each of them everything that would not suit the other. their minds most dissimilar. Where could have been the attraction? The answer soon presented itself. It had been in situation. They had been thrown together several weeks. They had been living in the same small family party. Since Henrietta's coming away, they must have been depending almost entirely on each other, and Louisa, just recovering from illness, had been in an interesting state, and Captain Benwick was not inconsolable. That was a point which Anne had not been able to avoid suspecting before, and instead of drawing the same conclusion as Mary from the present course of events, they served only to confirm the idea of his having felt some dawning of tenderness toward herself. She did not mean, however, to drive much more from it to gratify her vanity than Mary might have allowed. She was persuaded that any tolerably pleasing young woman who had listened and seemed to feel for him would have received the same compliment. He had an affectionate heart. He must love somebody. So what she said here was that despite Mary saying that Benwick must have never had intentions for Anne is saying that he probably did simply because she was a listening ear, a willing. Do I have something in my hair? No. A willing ear. And soon Benwick was accompanied by Louisa for weeks on end, and she was all but willing to listen because she was a bit incapacitated. So his attachment to her, to Anne, quickly just went to the nearest best option, you know? Men. I'm kidding. Just Benwick. She saw no reason against their being happy. Louisa had fine naval fever to begin with, and they would soon grow more alike. He would gain cheerfulness, and she would learn to be an enthusiast for Scott and Lord Byron. Nay, that was probably learnt already. Of course, they had fallen in love over poetry. The idea of Louisa Musgrove, turned into a person of literary taste and sentimental reflection, was amusing, but she had no doubt of its being so. The day at Lyme, the fall from the Cobb, might influence her health, her nerves, her courage, her character to the end of her life, as thoroughly as it appeared to have influenced her fate. The conclusion of the whole was, that if the woman who had been sensible of Captain Wentworth's merits could be allowed to prefer another man, there was nothing in the engagement to excite lasting wonder, and if Captain Wentworth lost no friend by it, certainly nothing to be regretted. No, it was not regret which made Anne's heart beat in spite of herself, and brought the colour into her cheeks when she thought Captain Wentworth unshackled and free. She had some feelings which she was ashamed to investigate. They were too much like joy, senseless joy. She longed to see the Crofts, but when the meeting took place, it was evident that no rumour of the news had yet reached them. The visit of ceremony was paid and returned, and Louisa Musgrove was mentioned, and Captain Benwick too, without even half a smile. The Crofts had placed themselves in lodgings in Gay Street, perfectly to Sir Walter's satisfaction. He was not at all ashamed of the acquaintance, and did, in fact, think and talk a great deal more about the Admiral than the Admiral ever thought or talked about him. The Crofts knew quite as many people in Bath as they wished for, and considered their intercourse with the Elliots as a mere matter of form, and not in the least likely to afford them any pleasure. They brought with them their country habit of being almost always together. He was ordered to walk, to keep off the gout, and Miss Croft seemed to go shares with him in everything, and to walk for her life to do him good. Anne saw them wherever she went. Lady Russell took her out to her carriage almost every morning, and she never failed to think of them, never failed to see them. Knowing their feelings as she did, it was a most attractive picture of happiness to her. She always watched them as long as she could, delighted to fancy she understood what they might be talking of, as they walked along in happy independence, or equally delighted to see the Admiral's hearty shake of the hand when he encountered an old friend, and observed their eagerness of conversation when occasionally forming into a little knot of navy, Miss Croft looking as intelligent and keen as any of the officers around her. Anne was too much engaged with Lady Russell to be often walking herself, but it so happened that one morning, about a week or 10 days after the Crofts' arrival, it suited her best to leave her friend, or her friend's carriage, in the lower part of the town and return alone to Camden Place. And in the walking up Milsom Street, she had the good fortune to meet with the Admiral. He was standing by himself at a print shop window, with his hands behind him in earnest contemplation of some print, and she not only might have passed him unseen, but was obliged to touch as well as address him before she could catch his notice. When he did perceive and acknowledge her, however, it was done with all his usual frankness and good humor. "Ah! It is you? Thank you, thank you. This is treating me like a friend. Here I am, you see, staring at a picture. I can never get by this shop without stopping. But that a thing here is by way of a boat. Do look at it. Do you ever see the like? Did you ever see the like? What queer fellows your fine painters must be to think that anybody would venture their lives in such a shapeless old cockle shell as that. And yet, here are two gentlemen stuck up in it mightily at their ease, and looking about them at the rocks and mountains as if they were not to be upset the next moment, which they certainly must be. I wonder where that boat was built. Laughing heartily, I would not venture over a horse pond in that. Well, turning away. Now, where are you bound? Can I go any can I go anywhere for you or with you? Can I be of any use? None, I thank you, unless you will give me the pleasure of your company and the little way our road lies together. I'm going home. That I will, with all my heart and further too. Yes, yes, we will have a snug walk together, and I have something to tell you as we go along. There, take my arm. That's right. I do not feel comfortable if I have not a woman there. Lord, what a boat it is. Taking a last look at the picture as they began to be in motion. Did you say you had something to tell me, sir? Yes, I have, presently. But here comes a friend, Captain Brendan. I shall only say, "How d'ye do?" as we pass. However, I shall not stop. How d'ye do? Brigden stares to see anybody with me but my wife. She, poor soul, is tired by the leg. She has a blister on one of her heels, as large as a 3-shilling piece. If you look across the street, you will see Admiral Brand coming down and his brother. Shabby fellows, both of them. I am glad they are not on this side of the way. A Sophie cannot bear them. They played me a pitiful trick once, got away some of my best men. I will tell you the whole story another time. There comes old Sir Archibald Drew and his grandson. Look, he sees us. He kisses his hand to you. He takes you for my wife. Ha! The piece has come too soon for that younker. Poor old Sir Archibald. How do you like Bath, Miss Elliot? It suits us very well. We are always meeting with some old friend or other. The street's full of them every morning, sure to have of chat. And then we get away from them all and shut ourselves into our lodgings and draw in our chairs and are as snug as if we were in Kellynch, ay, or as we used to be even at North Yarmouth and Deal. We do not like our lodgings here the worse, I can tell you, for putting us in mind of those we first had at North Yarmouth. The wind blows through one of the cupboards just in the same way. When they were got a little farther, Anne ventured to press again for what he had to communicate. She had hoped, when clear of Milsom Street, to have her curiosity gratified. But she was still obliged to wait, for the Admiral had made up his mind not to begin till they had gained the greater space and quiet of Belmont, and as she was not really Miss Croft, she must let him have his own way. As soon as they were fairly ascending Belmont, he began. Well, now you shall hear something that will surprise you. But first of all, you must tell me the name of the young lady I am going to talk about. That young lady, you know, that we have all been so concerned for, the Miss Musgrove, that all this has been happening to. Her Christian name, I always forget her Christian name. Anne had been ashamed to appear to comprehend so soon, as she really did, but now she could safely suggest the name of Louisa. Ay, ay, Miss Louisa Musgrove, that is the name. I wish young ladies had not such a number of fine Christian names. I should never be out, if they were all Sophies or something of that sort. Well, Miss Louisa, we all thought, you know, was to marry Frederick. He was courting her week after week. The only wonder was what they could be waiting for, till the business at Lyme came. Okay. Till business. The only wonder was what they would be waiting for till the business at line came. Then, indeed, it was clear enough that they must wait till her brain was set to right. But even then, there was something odd in their way of going on. Instead of staying at Lyme, he went off to Plymouth, and then he went off to see Edward. Then he came back from Minehead. He was gone down to Edward's, and there he has been ever since. We have seen nothing of him since November. Even Sophie could not understand it, but now the matter has taken the strangest turn of all. For this young lady, this same Miss Musgrove, instead of being to marry Frederick, is to marry James Benwick. You know James Benwick. A little. I am a little acquainted with Captain Benwick. Well, she is to marry him. Nay, most likely they are married already, for I do not know what they should wait for. I thought Captain Benwick's a very pleasing man, said Anne, and I understand that he bears an excellent character. Oh, yes, yes, there is not a word to be said against James Benwick. He is only a commander, it is true, made last summer. And those are bad times for getting on, but he has not another fault that I know of. An excellent, good-hearted fellow, I assure you, a very active, zealous officer, too, which is more than you would think for. Perhaps for that soft sort of manner does not do him justice. Indeed, you are mistaken there, sir. I should never argue want of spirit from Captain Benwick's manners. I thought them particularly pleasing, and I will answer for it they would generally please. Well, well, ladies are the best judges, but James Benwick is rather too piano for me, and though very likely it is all our partiality, Sophie and I cannot help thinking Frederick's manners better than his. There is something about Frederick more to our taste. Anne was caught. She had only meant to oppose the too common idea of spirit and gentleness being incompatible with each other, not at all to represent Captain Benwick's manners as the very best that could possibly be, and after a little hesitation she was beginning to say, I was not entering into any comparison of the two friends, but the Admiral interrupted her with, and the thing is certainly true. It is not a mere bit of gossip. We have it from Frederick himself. His sister had a letter from him yesterday, in which he tells us of it, and he had just had it in a letter from Harville, written upon the spot from Uppercross. I fancy they are all at Uppercross. This was an opportunity which Anne could not resist. She said, therefore, I hope, Admiral, I hope there is nothing in the style of Captain Wentworth's letter to make you and Miss Croft particularly uneasy. It did certainly seem last autumn as if there were an attachment between him and Louisa Musgrove, but I hope it may be understood to have worn out on such side equally and without violence. I hope his letter does not breathe the spirit of an ill-used man. Not at all, not at all. There is not an oath or a murmur from beginning to end. Anne looked down to hide her smile. No, no, Frederick is not a man to whine and complain. He has too much spirit for that. If the girl likes another man better, it is very fit she should have him. Certainly, but what I mean is that I hope there is nothing in Captain Wentworth's manner of writing to make you suppose he thinks himself ill-used by his friend, which might appear, you know, without its being absolutely said. I should be very sorry that such a friendship as has subsided between him and Captain Benwick should be destroyed, or even wounded, by a circumstance of this sort. Yes, yes, I understand you, but there is nothing at all of that nature in the letter, but does not give the least filling at Benwick. Does not so much as say, I wonder at it. I have a reason of my own for wondering at it. No, you would not guess from his way of writing that he had ever thought of Miss, what's her name, for himself. He very handsomely hopes that they will be happy together, and there is nothing very unforgiving in that, I think. Anne did not receive the perfect conviction which the Admiral meant to convey, but it would have been useless to press the inquiry further. She therefore satisfied herself with commonplace remarks or quiet attention, and the Admiral had it all his own way. Poor Frederick, said he at last. Now he must begin all over again with somebody else. I think he must get him to Bath. Sophie must write and beg him to come to Bath. Here are pretty girls enough, I am sure. It would be of no use to go to Uppercross again, for that other Miss Musgrove, I find, is bespoke by her cousin, the young parson. Do not you think, Miss Elliot, we had better try to get him to Bath? Woo! Is Captain Wentworth coming to Bath? Anyway, all exciting. And I lasted a lot longer than I thought, with several breaks for tea. Until next time, stay warm. Bye.